So I'm Janya Kelly. I work out of the Mississauga, Ontario office in Canada. I've been working in the area of climate change for over 10 years now, and I've been specializing in physical risks, really working with a lot of different discipline teams so we can help integrate climate considerations into all of the great technical work we're doing as a company. So Phil, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Janya, and hello and welcome everyone. My name is Phil Osborne. I'm a geomorphologist based in the Vancouver office of WSP. And as a geomorphologist, I have a background in coastal processes, and I do a lot of work related to coastal hazards and coastal risk assessments. And I've been working more and more in the area of nature-based solutions for addressing coastal hazards and adaptation. So we'll get started. I would like to begin with an acknowledgement to the contributions from our multidisciplinary team. We have a local team based in Anchorage, Alaska, that's led by Rick Mitchells and Andy Garrigus. There's the climate risk team in Mississauga. You've met Janya. There's also Sean Capstick and Patrick Breach. And here in Vancouver, the coastal hazards team, myself, Ashwin Gadgil, and Kevan Maluji. So we'll jump right in. So coastal communities around the world need to decide how to manage the risk associated with climate change. In northern communities, this risk is often associated with hazards such as flooding, erosion, the loss of sea ice, ground ice, and permafrost. We've developed a risk assessment methodology that combines likelihood-based coastal modeling with climate risk assessment. We will illustrate the approach we took in application to the community of Shaktoolik, Alaska. The approach can work successfully in any location, subject to similar hazard and climate risk. Global sea levels began rising about 120 years ago, rising by 16 to 20 centimeters between 1900 and 2016. In the last half century, sea level rise rates have accelerated to approximately 30 centimeters per century. And most of that acceleration we understand to be due to anthropogenic warming, driving thermal ocean expansion and melting of land-based ice sheets. We expect rates to further accelerate over the next century, so we can experience about a meter of rise globally as a likely scenario, with up to 2 to 3 meters of rise being physically plausible, depending on the degree of warming. Water levels at the coast are controlled not only by sea level, but by tides and storm activity, which brings storm surges and waves, both of which contribute to extreme high water levels. Shown here are 100-year return period total sea levels projected in the year 2100, including effects of tides, storm surge, and waves setup from a global modeling study. As global sea levels rise, the action of tides, waves, storm surges, and tsunamis will increase the likelihood of coastal flooding and erosion from present-day levels. In this global map from the same study, the color of the dots indicates the future extreme sea level in 2100 for the RCP 8.5 scenario, accounting for sea level rise, tides, storm surge, and waves. The size of the dot indicates the increase of inundated area due to sea level rise by coastline length and illustrates the primary hotspots in terms of inundation. The key point is sea level rise is a global problem and will impact many communities, large and small, over the next century. Many remote coastal communities in the state of Alaska face significant threats from climate change hazards, including erosion, flooding, and thawing permafrost and ice. This map shows coastal communities filtered from a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers statewide threat assessment, which considered 115 different communities. The red dots are communities with a higher combined threat level that are in the top 20. Orange dots are communities with intermediate threat levels in the top 35. Yellow dots are lower threat, but still within the top 50. 33 of the top 50 are coastal communities. And our community of interest, Shaktoolik, situated on the east end of Norton Sound, was ranked #1 in the study. I'm going to pass the mic to Janya to talk about our climate risk methodology.
So knowing what Shaktoolik and other global communities are going through, how do we start to provide support to them? As Phil mentioned, we've developed a climate risk and adaptation solution that's been built on 4 different pillars illustrated in this diagram. And at the center of it is stakeholder engagement. In the first pillar, we want to understand the climate-related hazards and what risks they present under current and future climate. In the second pillar, we develop thresholds for when action needs to be taken based on the risks and the tools to support these decisions. In the third pillar, we want to assess mitigation options to reduce these risks, as well as develop any adaptation pathways to help plan for the future. And in the fourth pillar, we use monitoring to understand how the risks and thresholds develop over time and when we need to trigger action that has been planned out in the second and third pillars. By actively engaging stakeholders throughout this process, they can take more ownership at each stage as it moves from very technical studies in the early pillars to practical actions at the end. Let's look at the importance of the stakeholder engagement for the Shaktoolik project. Shaktoolik has already participated in a number of coastal impact studies. And what they wanted to know this time, what was different? We needed to find a way to transition our technical analysis into practical actions the community could take. They didn't need another report to just sit on the shelf. It was important to continuously check in with the community and gather their knowledge and experience to support the project. This was also essential in filling in the gaps in the observation record. Understanding the community values and concerns helped us design and develop the process and the approach for the project. In the words of our colleague Rick Mitchells, we're experts in what we do, but we're not experts in everything. It's more than gathering information. It's figuring out how to communicate the results back in meaningful language. The lived experience or perception of risk may be different than the modeled results. The combination of the two is what's really important to have meaningful engagement and to help promote ownership of the process. Let's go back to our approach and start walking through the pillars. As I've mentioned before, the first pillar is aimed at understanding the climate hazards and their associated risks. We followed the 5-step process shown here to complete the risk assessment. To better capture community experience, we completed 2 separate risk rankings under current climate conditions, one based on community experience and one based on the coastal modeling. We explored the differences between the rankings with the community to understand how this could impact any future projections of risk, which were based on the coastal modeling. Now, Phil will explain this coastal modeling and how it was completed for the project before we discuss the risk results. So I'll pass it back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Janya. Coastal hazards hinge on the exposure to coastal processes that drive extreme high water levels and waves that contribute to both flooding and erosion. Extreme water levels were established by a Monte Carlo analysis to first combine tides and storm surges to account for random occurrence of storm surge with respect to tide. This analysis simulated a large number of random annual still water level events to establish an extreme value distribution for those still water levels. Waves were then estimated on those water levels using a SWAN 2-dimensional wave growth and transformation model forced by regional winds and computed on 3 nested grids and from up to 4 different wave directions in Norton Sound. The nested grids included an outer regional grid covering the eastern half of Norton Sound with a grid cell resolution of 1 kilometer. We then stepped it down in 2 nested grids such that the final nested grid covered the Shaktoolik nearshore area at a resolution of 10 meters. The outputs from this grid were taken as the nearshore wave heights for estimating the wave and erosion effects at Shaktoolik during storms. Wave model inputs were used to assess flooding and also input to a 1D version of a model known as X-Beach that was applied to estimate erosion effects at 20 different profiles along the coastline. Inundation or flood depth at Shaktoolik is the result of the extreme still water level on both the ocean and river sides of the spit, and the addition of wave effects on the ocean side. Inundation depth is therefore location specific and varies depending on the side of the spit, as well as the type of wave effect that occurs at any given location. To simplify things, we classified inundation depths into 3 classes for hazard and risk assessment. In the first zone, no overtopping of the crest of the spit occurs. In zone 2, overtopping of the crest occurs by wave runup. In zone 3, the spit overtops by the extreme still water level alone, allowing direct wave transmission, which can cause significant damage to infrastructure. We see that at the end of the spit is being overtopped by the extreme still water level, zone 3, even without wave effects, while parts of the spit with the community are in hazard zones 2 and 3. This zoomed-in view of the village shows that most of the key infrastructure can be inundated to depths of about half a meter under the 1 in 20 year event by the year 2050 for a likely scenario. Here we show a summary of the extent of the 3 inundation hazard zone classes applied to the risk assessment for different climate scenarios. Once again, hazard zones are no overtopping in green, overtopping by wave runup in yellow, and overtopping by the extreme high water level in red. The top graph shows inundation hazard for present conditions for 10, 20, 50, and 100-year events. We see that most of the spit is already classed as zone 2 and 3 under 50-year and 100-year events. The middle graph shows the same classes for likely, possible, and certain climate scenarios for selected return periods by the year 2050. And the lower graph shows the same classes for a likely climate scenario for the 20-year event by the year 2100. The key point is, with climate change, the likelihood and extent of zones 2 and 3 increases for a relatively plausible present-day flood. Back to you, Janya.
Thanks, Phil. At the end of the first stage of the risk assessment approach, we should understand what risks are present and how they could change in the future. For this study, we defined risk as a combination of likelihood and consequence scores. From a technical standpoint, likelihood was based on the hazard return periods and consequence was based on the coastal modeling results that Phil just shared. For this project, the hazard zone classes were converted straight to the consequence score, so that's zone 1, 2, and 3. When working with the community, we define likelihood relative to the youth. It's defined as low if the climate hazard has been experienced in the past by the elders, medium if it's experienced by their parents, and almost certain if it has occurred within their own lifetime. Consequence categories were developed with the community based on their observations of the hazard impacts and how they could impact community life. So shown in this figure on the vertical axis, I have risks going from low to high. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the 3 different time periods that we looked at: current, near future, and far future. For this study, the highest risk score between the community experience and the modeled risk was used for conservatism. What we've represented here in the icons is the significant buildings and infrastructure in the community and showing how they vary over time within the different risk categories and also by period. Let's focus on 2 different examples, the power plant and the borrow pit. As you can see, the power plant moves from a low risk under current conditions up to a high risk under far future condition due to the changing inundation levels. Both the likelihood and the consequence were increasing over time to help create this change. On the other hand, the borrow pit sustains a high risk across all time periods, again due to the inundation level under all the scenarios modeled. However, when we talked to the community, their experience ranked it as a medium risk. The technical analysis that we completed only considered the inundation that was occurring, not the potential impact, where the community considered both. This is an excellent example of the importance of combining that lived experience with the technical analysis. Now that we know these risks, how do we turn this into practical action for the community? We can turn risks into practical actions through decision-making tools. One example is using triggers and thresholds. We worked with the community to develop different risk thresholds based on their primary area of concern or trigger. to help decide the timing of adaptation options and potential relocation. The primary areas of concern are compared to the threshold listed under the 3 levels of risk we've shown in this table. Manageable risks require minor adjustments to their daily activities and community planning, but mostly things can continue as normal. If these risks increase, then adaptation options can be brought in to reduce the risks at a lower cost than relocation, but will likely have notable impacts on the community daily life. Risks become unmanageable when they are not sufficiently reduced by the available adaptation options and the community can no longer maintain safety or quality of life. Now I'll pass it back to Phil to discuss some of the adaptation and mitigation options for the community moving to the next stage of the process.
The community is now in the position that they know they need to move again sometime in the future. But in the short to medium term, they have made the decision to stay and defend in place for as long as they can hold out. The question then is, what should they do about erosion and flood protection in the interim? By necessity, the community's default approach to coastal protection is a nature-based solution. The community has constructed a protection berm by piling sediment excavated from the end of the spit on the upper beach profile in front of the community. You can see the berm in the upper right photo. The constructed berm provides erosion and flood protection to the community. However, it's recognized that the berm is vulnerable to erosion during storm events under current environmental conditions, and maintenance must occur regularly, even after moderate storm events. Our analysis shows that this will be an ongoing effort for the community. Bristol Engineering, our client, conducted a berm alternative analysis, considering the berm constructed with local materials and several more traditional engineered solutions constructed with imported rock and other materials. Interestingly, the protection berm constructed with local materials was found to have the lowest life cycle cost relative to other options, but it does have the disadvantage of requiring almost continuous maintenance. So what are the next steps for the community? Here again, we see a view of the protection berm after a storm. We get a sense of its scale and the problem they experience with the development of the erosion scar. So one option that we're pursuing is the development of a local rock quarry that could be an option for reducing the cost of the alternatives that require a source of armor stone and could help increase or improve the resilience of the berm. Costs to develop and operate a rock quarry indicate a range of between $5 and $6.5 million, with an operating cost of about $1 million a year to operate. Currently, we're working with Bristol to support the community with a material sourcing study to evaluate if there are feasible sources of material within the reach and means of the community. And we're also conducting a berm design optimization study, which we've just begun to use to evaluate options to enhance the performance of the berm and increase its lifespan. Significant part of the berm optimization study is to extend the X-Beach morphodynamic response modeling that we began in the first phase and simulate both the hydrodynamics and morphodynamic processes that impact, that a result of impacts during storm events. X-Beach is a modeling software designed to account for the effects of long period waves known as surf beat. And these long waves are a known key mechanism determining beach erosion and accretion. Some of the options we will be considering in the study include an enhanced berm constructed with local materials derived from the Shaktoolik spit, and 2 additional variants. The first variant is simply a composite berm constructed with local materials with the additional rock, gravel, cobble, and boulder materials that can be sourced within the region. The second is a hybrid that includes the enhanced composite berm, additional rock material, and the addition of a low weir type groin or oblique headlands that can be constructed with boulders to reduce alongshore material transport. The idea is then to test whether these modifications that include placement geometry, beach slope, and material size variations can help create a berm with a longer lifespan that requires less maintenance for the community. Back to you, Janya.
Thanks. The berm optimization is an excellent example of mitigation measures that fall under the 3rd pillar. Let's talk about the fourth pillar now, which is focused on the monitoring of the risks and the thresholds, triggering action that's been planned out in the second and third pillars. This is really the stage where stakeholders can take ownership of the approach and turn it into a continuous improvement process, such as monitoring the berm and taking ownership of the maintenance. Monitoring programs can be implemented, which inform the stakeholders' understanding of the risks and thresholds, as well as about the performance of any implemented adaptation options. This information can then be used to support the risk assessment or any following risk assessments, as well as any decision points around mitigations and their adaptation options, creating this iterative process with all the other stages. The community can now make decisions based on a dynamic process that captures their concerns instead of just having a static report. For Shaktoolik, multiple adaptation pathways are available to either defend in place or relocate, but each pathway is associated with costs to the community and impacts to their subsistence living. By providing a dynamic, stakeholder-focused process to evaluate climate risk, the community can now make informed decisions around their future planning. For example, the study Phil presented on optimizing the berm. The community needs a solution that considers the available materials and location, as well as the community's way of life. Completing the berm optimization study will provide the community with the information needed to support future community planning. In summary, when looking at climate impacts on coastal risks, is it better to stay the course and adapt to changing coastal hazards, or is it better to plan to retreat from the coast? As we've shown from the Shaktoolik project example, the answer is not always straightforward. The answer depends on the needs and priorities of the stakeholders involved, as well as the costs and benefits of the adaptation and mitigation. However, the approach and lessons learned from Shaktoolik that we've shown here can be applied to any other coastal location. Our scalable approach is focused on stakeholder engagement with continuous improvement to support long-term climate resilience and sustainability. Without meaningful engagement, the transition from the technical knowledge to practical solutions is very challenging. The approach to address coastal risk captures complex concerns with meaningful actions, empowering stakeholders to confidently make these decisions into the future. This is WSP Golder's key differentiator, combining our technical experience into practical and accessible solutions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're very proud of this project and pleased to share it with you. And we'd like to open up the question portion of the presentation now.
Thank you, Janya and Phil, for a fantastic presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download a PDF version of this presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. If you can open your webcam, it will be really nice to see you. Thank you. I will start with the first question. This is regarding climate data. When do we quit calculation with mean data instead of new high historical data? Mean is losing meaning for flood protection.
I'll take a first stab at this one, Phil. So when we're looking at climate data, we should always be looking at the most recent observations. Climate is evolving very quickly. So yes, please always look at those recent high observations. When we start looking into the future, we often start with the mean projections because it's the most readily available information, and we like to think of it as a screening value. So use that as the first test to see how things are changing. However, when you are looking at future projections, it's important to consider the multi-model ensemble or all the projections that are available and start to consider different percentiles across those ranges. From the IPCC, we consider all future projections equally probable at this point. We don't prefer one over the other. So what we need to do as a company is consistently consider the climate data in a way that looks at this full range, but also considers the most recent and reliable observations when we are considering future impacts. Did you want to add anything to that, Phil, based on your experience?
I think you've got it well covered there, Janya. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there areas of lessons learned from elsewhere, like brownfield redevelopment for adaptation?
I think I'll start with this one, if that's okay. I think this is an interesting question. Many brownfield redevelopments, from my experience, are often implementing nature-based approaches to landscape restoration. So, and I think there are a number of valuable lessons learned from these types of projects, especially with respect to the time frame and the time lags that are involved in reestablishing vegetation, for example, reestablishing habitat, and just getting those projects to take hold. In my experience, there's often a significant time lag between the implementation and the product and the result, and so we have to have some patience, and we have to monitor carefully in order to make sure that the project is progressing in the way that we expect.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is we should always be trying to learn from different sites to apply to other ones. There's more crossover than we realize between our disciplines and between our projects. So anytime we can learn from one another and bring in an innovative solution, it helps us move forward as a sustainable company.
Thank you. How many sea level rise scenarios did you look at?
This is you, Phil.
I'm trying to recall exactly how many we did. Quite a number of different ones. We looked at both, RCP scenarios, the number of different RCP scenarios, as well as probabilistic sea level conditions based on the NOAA projections for global sea level rise. We considered that in the case of Shaktoolik, because it was an unglaciated part of Alaska, that it would be, and this is based also on local geodetic information, or at least regional geodetic information in the case of Shaktoolik, that it would be rising at global rates, and they're a pretty reasonable analog. There is some regional data that suggests that is the case in that part of Alaska for the most part.
Thank you. The next question is, will the berm study be applied on the full length of the spit in the village? And was a decision taken to retreat in some areas?
Good question too. The berm study is being applied to the length of the village, which is about 1.5 to 2 kilometers in total. We'll be looking in the X-Beach modeling at a domain of about 4 kilometers in length. The spit itself is more than 25 kilometers in length, so we're only looking at a portion of the spit. Our plan at the moment is to possibly use 2 X-Beach domains that we're setting up right now to do that. That'll cover 2 kind of 4 kilometer long sections along the coast, but we will be limited by the computational capacity and budget that we have to conduct that.
And I don't believe there was any portion that was going to retreat. I think they're all staying together.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
The rate of retreat is.
Oh, okay. Yes, the rate of retreat. Yeah.
Yeah, rate of retreat is fairly consistent. It's a longshore transport dominated system. So I think by modeling it in a region that includes the community and has some overlap on both the north and south ends, we will cover that shoreline evolution.
Thank you. What return period are you targeting for the adaptations?
I guess this is me again. In terms of what we're trying to do is basically give the community some breathing room to make the decisions, the more difficult decisions that involve retreat. And so our goal is to get to also reduce the amount of effort that they need to put into berm restoration. One of the big challenges the community faces is that they have very limited natural resources that are suitable for construction. They also have limited resources for the construction itself. They have a dump truck, they have a loader, and they have some excavators and things like that, but they don't have a lot of heavy equipment. And if you're trying to protect about 1 kilometer or more, or 1.5 kilometers of shoreline, that's a pretty big coastal protection project in any means. So the return period that we're looking at is, can we increase right now the lifespan of the berm is maybe a couple of years at the most. Sometimes it's even less than that. So what we're trying to do is just stretch that out and make that berm last maybe 5 years and a little bit longer by enhancing its mitigating it with some coastal engineering, some creative coastal engineering, either groins or headland type structures, or toe protection at the toe of the berm using some local rock material that we can source locally. We're also looking at the geometry of the berm to improve that if we can. So return period, it's a tricky question around the adaptation in the short to medium term, but it's really just to see if we can enhance it out to 5 to 10 years maybe at this stage.
The only thing I'd add in there is that, yeah, we're trying to gather information. So we're definitely in that fourth pillar, that monitoring, to understand how the berm is going to respond over time, how everything Phil just said about getting that better understanding so the community can buy some time to make a more informed decision. They'll use the outcomes of the study that Phil and his team are now completing about the optimization to feed back into the climate risk assessment process and then reevaluate what adaptation options they may have at that point. But ultimately, they do want a long-term solution to avoid any relocation, but we are looking out. I think when we did our study, we looked out for mid-century and end of century.
Fantastic, thank you. I will take the last question. Sorry, we're a bit over time. Thank you for staying here with us. Are any of the solutions being developed applicable to inland locations where major rain events, erosion, are more frequent?
Do you want to start on this one, Janya, with the rainfall side of it, and then I can talk about other inland applications on the coast?
Sure. So anything that we've done from a climate data perspective, whether it's coastal or whether it's inland, the processes are very similar. It's understanding what is being said about the future. How does that interact with your understanding of other infrastructure or processes that are going on? And we can follow a very similar risk assessment process. So ours is a little bit less location dependent. What we rely on is interfacing with knowledgeable teams. So we would work with a more local surface water, or if it's riverine flooding that we're looking at, whoever the expert is, what is their model and how can we get those future climate projections reliably into their model to get a better understanding of what's happening in the future itself. So from my perspective, very applicable, very transferable.
Yeah, I'd just add likewise from our perspective in the geomorphic space and coastal space, the solutions that we're developing are applicable to inland waters, lakes, reservoirs, and also rivers to a large extent. Mm-hmm. Many of the frontline communities that we're working with in Alaska are riverine communities that have either coastal riverine combined environments, or they're purely riverine environments. Many of them facing similar kinds of threats and challenges to Shaktoolik. They may face water level fluctuations. They may face river flooding and ice jamming processes and things like that. Some of the processes are a little bit different, but there are many similar kinds of processes and mechanisms. And certainly the changes in things like wave climate and wind patterns that we used for modeling at Shaktoolik are transferable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Thank you for staying with us. So we're a bit over time, so feel free to follow up directly with the presenters with any question that you still have. We received a lot of questions. All of these will be answered directly by the presenter via email. So thank you again for staying with us today, and thank you for your presentation, Janya and Phil, and have a wonderful day, everyone. I will wrap up the webinar now. Thank you.